You all, I think, know me by now, but my name is Caleb Graves. I'm a Duke Divinity School intern here at Binkley Baptist Church until April. And a lot of my research at Duke has been on altered states of consciousness, mystical experiences in psychology, and particularly psychedelic substances and how this has been doing this for the past 2 years. Especially given research that's going on at the Johns Hopkins Institute for Consciousness and Psychedelic Studies. I think this is an important topic that we need to talk about. In 2002, during a survey on young adults and health, we discovered that about 3% of young adults were using hallucinogenic or psychedelic drugs every year. A decade later, in 2021, we found that that number had jumped to 8.4% of young adults were using psychedelic or hallucinogenic drugs every year, which is an incredible increase, especially considering that use of other drugs has decreased during the same time period. So in this presentation today, I'm going to look at what psychedelic drugs are, how they are being used therapeutically, the history of these substances, and what sort of questions they're going to raise for Christians today and the church that they happen to be part of. There we go. So, first question, and there's a lot that goes into this, is what are psychedelic substances? Psychedelic substances are powerful psychoactive substances, meaning that they affect the human mind and the way our cognition works and the way that we experience the world around us. This might seem self-explanatory, but it's worthwhile to go over. A lot of drugs, however, affect the way that we see the world. This isn't surprising. Even the caffeine that many of us drank this morning in our cup of coffee or tea might perk us up a little bit. We're noticing details a little bit better, and it affects the way that we view the world. But psychedelics in particular are defined by the hallucinogenic states that they create, meaning that they affect our sensory input of the world. And also they create feelings of awe or wonder, transcendence, joy, things that would be defined as mystical or spiritual states as well. These substances can be natural or synthetic. So natural psychedelics that you might see are from psilocybin, that is created in the human body after ingesting magic mushrooms. You might see peyote, which contains mescaline, used in a lot of indigenous practices. Or you might even see a few lesser known ones. A root of a bush in Africa is a common indigenous psychedelic drug as well. There are hundreds of such substances that have been synthetically created or discovered. But generally speaking, we're going to be focusing on the classical psychedelics, which include LSD, which you might know as acid or Lucy, psilocybin, which is found in magic mushrooms, DMT, which is used in the indigenous brew called ayahuasca, and then mescaline, which is found in peyote and San Pedro cacti. So while there might be a lot of other substances, and you might hear those referenced in the presentation, I'm really going to focus on those classical substances more than anything else. So when we talk about hallucinogenic experiences or psychedelic experiences, or what is commonly understood as a trip, it's hard to understand what these experiences are like if you haven't experienced them yourself. So throughout this presentation, I've tried to find quotes by people who have undergone these experiences in a therapeutic and clinical setting, whether that was from Harvard or Johns Hopkins or anywhere else. There's a few different sources for this. And if you want to know where I got some of my information or what sources I've derived my presentation from, I haven't cited them in the presentation, but feel free to come talk to me afterwards about that. So here are 3 different versions of people's discussions of what their psychedelic experiences were like in a therapeutic clinical setting. Subject QX said, "Matter and time seemed to be of no consequence. I was living in the most beautiful reality I had ever known, and it was eternal." Subject TD said, I had a vision in which the flowing colors seemed to be me, and it was infinity. Another subject said, early on, the visuals came and dissolved so quickly, I could not verbalize them in time. There were countless variations in what reminded me of the ceiling of Westminster Abbey, Gothic, vaulted with great intricacy. These images changed lighting, color, and texture. I had no doubt I was in the presence of the infinite because I felt an overriding peace that carried me through everything. On particularly high doses of these substances, particularly DMT, which was studied by Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico, people reported encountering what they perceived as other sentient beings that they saw as angels, or more adorably named the machine elves, because they were little creatures that you could encounter. Now, I tried to give some sort of image into what this could be like for someone by running images through the deep dream generator. The deep dream generator it's not exactly what a psychedelic experience is like, but it picks at the same parts of the brain when you look at these images that are also picked at by the psychedelic substances. So this is Duke University's chapel. And you can see a variety of different colors submerging between maybe the stone and the woodwork. You might even be able to pick out a few funny faces like this fox that turned out when I went put it through the generator. Or perhaps a little more familiar to us is our own sanctuary here at Binkley Baptist Church. And you can still recognize what this is. You see the cross in the center very vividly. But throughout are all of these different patterns and colors and shapes. And during an actual psychedelic experience, this would all be moving and shaping and just seem to be alive, changing the image on an almost second-by-second basis. Or maybe if you were particularly hungry after a psychedelic experience, you go to get some hot dogs down at a trolley stop or Sup Dogs. But wouldn't you know it, it almost looks like this hot dog has turned into a bit of a balloon animal, or maybe a little bit of a chicken there at the edge. And you find that it's just too beautiful or maybe too much like a balloon animal to eat. So this isn't exactly what the visuals might be like during the psychedelic experience, but there's a lot of overlap and similarities that at least give you an idea of how the visuals would change. Now, psychedelic substances, especially the more well-known ones like LSD or psilocybin, these have a very bad reputation in our culture. And more than that, in our legal system, psychedelic drugs federally are regulated under Schedule I, which means that they are not considered to have any health benefit and that they have a high probability of abuse. The problem, of course, being we know that our federal system on drug prosecution is a little bit politically motivated, has been used especially to hurt people of color and people in certain political groups. And this is not what we see with the data that we've been able to study with psychedelic drugs in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and then on into today's more recent research. So I wanted to go over three major myths that might be in culture or maybe even in some political rhetoric about psychedelic drugs. The first myth is that psychedelic drugs are addictive, that you might end up using these things all of the time like you would heroin or nicotine or alcohol. But unlike many other drugs, no classic psychedelic drugs are chemically addictive. Intolerance comes on very rapidly. Because of the intense nature of the experience, it would be incredibly difficult to take on a regular basis, and dosage would have to go up rapidly. So there is no chemical addiction that's possible, unlike even the coffee that we have every single morning, in which that caffeine is chemically addictive. And beyond that, studies have shown that there's very little potential for psychological addiction. A second myth is that psychedelics fry your brain. I'm sure you're familiar with the Just Say No ads. This is your brain, crack it into a frying pan, and this is your brain on drugs. While this might be the case for many substances that are out there, this is not the case for classical psychedelics. Studies have shown that classical psychedelic use does not seem to cause mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar. And hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, which is sort of that idea of the permanent trip, that you're always going to be a little bit off or see things out of the corner of your eye. There is no evidence that that is an actual issue that can arise from psychedelic drugs. And people that report this also report having high degrees of anxiety before ever taking the substances, and the symptoms track with their anxiety. So I don't know if you've ever had a panic attack and it almost feels like the floor has dropped out from under you, or that the whole world has grown darker or sort of moves away from you. That's a similar experience that people have from anxiety that they attribute to psychedelic drugs, but it is not caused by these substances. And finally, the last myth is that psychedelics can be lethal. But the fact is, while it is technically possible, overdosing on psychedelics is highly unlikely. One case study I found from the UK found a woman named CB who thought she was taking cocaine at a party, and she sniffed an entire line of LSD, which was 555 times the normal recreational dose. And she was fine. No long-term effects, no disability. Went to the hospital and just wrote it out for a little while. And more than that, after the experience, stopped using dangerous drugs like cocaine, stopped her heavy binge drinking, and named this as the most important experience of her life for getting herself on track and changing her lifestyle. All right. So going on past what psychedelic substances are, do you have any particular questions about what these substances are, what they do, or anything of that nature? No? All right, good. We'll hopefully have a small time for questions at the end as well, or you could always talk to me after. So long before the 60s and 70s with the Beatles and the Jefferson airplanes, indigenous people have been using psychedelic substances for thousands of years. The earliest definitive proof we have of psychedelic substance use comes from about 5,500 years before the present in Latin America. And this was the use of DMT as a snuff powder that indigenous people would use. Going on from there, around 900 BCE, we see ayahuasca use, which is also using DMT in indigenous cultures. But magic mushrooms as well have a long history in the Mexican mountains, which is where they derive from. As previously stated, there are psychedelic drugs in Africa that African tribes have used for years, but unfortunately, because of colonialism, many of these traditional practices were wiped out as these tribes were wiped out. Now, in response to the systematic wiping out of indigenous cultures, which was purposefully carried out by the Catholic Church to stop practices of indigenous psychedelic use, there were actually anti-colonial practices that evolved out of psychedelic drugs. So peyote, which you see right here, is a mescaline-containing cacti, which has been used by indigenous people for quite some time, but particularly came into use in the 19th century in response to really from their perspective, Eastern aggression, as the United States continued to populate the rest of the American Southwest. So as traditional practices were broken, indigenous people were forced off their land, families were torn apart. Some practices such as the ghost dance that you may have heard of, and peyote use specifically, were created as a form of anti-colonialism. So this was a way for indigenous people, including many Christians who were indigenous, to find a way to fight back, to build community with each other, and build a religious worldview that counteracted the American imperial vision. Indigenous members of the Native American Church even went on to say that they believed peyote was the comforter spoken of in the Gospel of John, that was being sent to people who had lost everything so that they could have a connection with God again. So fortunately, ayahuasca and magic mushrooms are still a gray area, but President Clinton actually signed an amendment to our drug laws in the 90s that allowed the Native American Church to use peyote, San Pedro cactus, and other mescaline-containing substances for indigenous religious use. Now, looking more into the present, we see Albert Hofmann and the creation of LSD. This is when things really shifted in Western scientific understandings of psychedelic drugs. While mescaline was known about since at least the 19th century, indigenous people were willing to initiate some outsiders into their rituals if it was done in a way that was going to, these people were going to advocate for indigenous peoples. But Albert Hofmann, seen here, was a Swiss chemist, and Hofmann was trying to figure out if a specific compound in rye had any medicinal value. And after going through 24 different versions that didn't really seem to do that much, he came across LSD 25, because it was the 25th version of this that he had synthesized. Hofmann forgot about it, didn't have anything to do with it for a number of years, but one morning felt a strong draw, he says, to re-synthesize the substance. After re-synthesizing it, he says, despite using all of the normal laboratory procedures for safety, he must have gotten some on his hands or on his face, and he had the first psychedelic experience using LSD. He did not know what was happening. He did not know what was occurring to him at all. He thought for a little while that maybe he was dying. But after the local doctor came by and assured him that his blood pressure was normal, his pulse was normal, just wait it out, you're going to be fine. He said that there was simply a stream of shapes and colors, of kaleidoscopic visions, that the beauty of the earth had opened up to him, and he was able to see his place in it as a piece of this cosmos. That was in 1943, and Hofmann went on to be a psychedelic advocate for his entire life. Well into 100 years of age, he continued to be an advocate for these substances. And this became available in the US in particular for use in psychiatric and psychological care. Small dosages were used throughout the 50s so that people who might have mental illness or trauma that they just can't talk about would feel safe and a little more open to speaking with a therapist about what had happened to them or why they feel the way that they do. And until the 70s, when LSD was made illegal, this was the use that it had in a number of offices around the US. Now, once Hofmann initiated LSD's psychiatric value in the US, it also gained religious value. Especially in the early 60s, but moving on into the 70s, we saw a number of cultural and academic figures who saw psychedelic drugs as an important part of America's coming of age, of the moving past militarism and imperialism, and what they saw as stuffy old religion into something new and different. Whether or not you recognize some of these people, you might know their names. This is Timothy Leary, who coined the term turn on, tune in, drop out. Ram Dass, who is a big meditation advocate in the US, also originally known as Richard Alpern. This is Huston Smith, who wrote The World's Religions. He introduced America to what it meant to be friends with Muslims or Hindus or Jews and how beliefs differed. He too was a psychedelic advocate and was his entire life until he died. And this here is Bill W., who founded Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, Bill W. was also given LSD at one point and described it as an identical experience to the religious experience that led him to found AA. He was so enthralled with the therapeutic value of LSD that he even considered creating a new 12-step program that integrated it into their therapeutic process. This, of course, was scrapped after these drugs were made illegal, but it shows you how important this used to be in the world of psychiatry and the world of religion. That one of the largest, I would argue, religious associations in the world, Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's split off with Narcotics Anonymous or Overeaters Anonymous, that the 12-step process even considered integrating LSD into treatment. Now, unfortunately, these substances were made illegal after the beginning of the 70s and end of the 60s. But I will say it's important to recognize that peyote and San Pedro cactus, drugs used by Native Americans, those had been illegal since the 30s. They had specifically been illegal since the 30s because they were used by indigenous peoples. If you wanted to be a chemist, or not even chemist, somebody who had access to the mail system, you could put in a mail order for mescaline, get it sent to your house within a few weeks. But if you were an indigenous person who picked a cactus up off the side of the trail, now you are a felon and could be sentenced to years in prison. This is the double standard that has been given for Western science compared to indigenous cultures who have lived thousands of years longer than we have with these substances. Now, I know that was a lot of things, a lot of stuff to think about, a lot of history. Does anyone have any questions at this point about the history and previous use of these substances?
Why was LSD made illegal?
Why? It was, again, being put in Schedule 1 was the idea that it had a high potential for abuse and no medical value. Both of those things we already knew in the 60s weren't true. But what LSD was known for is its association with the counterculture movement and with the anti-war movement. Now, just like with indigenous movements, you might not be able to outlaw the people, but you might be able to outlaw what substances they use. For instance, there are some examples of certain types of beer being outlawed for periods in the UK, which were associated with the Irish. Whereas liquor or wine or other types of beer were freely available, only Irish types of beer could get you in trouble. It's a similar idea. You might not be able to just round up anti-war protesters and put them in prison or their leaders, but if you can catch them using something that's part of their subculture, then you can put them in prison. This was largely done, I have an original copy, using the media. So Life magazine had the exploding threat of the mind drug that got out of control, LSD. And this is where you saw a lot of those stories about people who thought they could fly and jumped out of a hotel room, or that took one dose of LSD and never woke up again. They were just permanently in La La Land. A lot of these stories had no basis in scientific fact, but it created a public fear about these substances that helped make them illegal. March 25th, 1966.
So some of those might not have had any basis in scientific fact, but some did as well. Like some people take LSD and go out there naked in the woods and lost their stuff for a while and need to go to a hospital.
Sure.
Some people, if they got into more like didn't make it with the band, didn't make it with the drug usage and like was gone there. So I think it is fair for us to be having this discussion, but we should also be real about the fact that maybe it doesn't cause some of the mental health issues that you were talking about. But if you are already wired for some of those mental health issues, there can be a danger with the effects. You have free time doesn't mean it's just playing, right?
No, I agree with that with most of the recreational use that is happening today. But we also have a number of studies that have come out that lifetime use of psychedelics has no connection with lifetime psychotic illness. So if you are using psychedelic drugs during your lifetime, the odds of you developing schizophrenic or bipolar or other similar psychotic illnesses is not higher. So because of that, sure, you can say that this triggers something, but at the same time, alcohol could do that, or an incredibly stressful event. So we do need to be careful with this the same way that we're careful with alcohol or other similar substances. But that doesn't mean that we should be more afraid of these substances or outlawing these substances more than we are for alcohol, for instance. Having a 21 years of age limit on drinking is good because, and marijuana is good because we know this does affect brain development, and we don't want that to affect young people as well. Anything else? All right. So, all that being said, why does this matter for the church and Christian faith? This is all well and good. This is an interesting conversation, but why does it affect us as Christians or affect the church? So, in response to decriminalization and legalization, such as in Oregon and Colorado, psychedelic use is growing rapidly. As I said before, use among young adults grew by almost 3% in the past decade. At the same time, the decriminalization and legalization in Oregon and Colorado was not just so that you can't, for instance, buy magic mushrooms at a store, but they are creating psilocybin treatment centers for PTSD, anxiety, etc. MDMA treatment, which is what could be described as a psychedelic, MDMA treatment might be approved by the FDA this year, and you might see people being prescribed that by a doctor in a clinical setting. And psilocybin is looking to be approved within the next 3 years. So with that in mind, usage in a therapeutic, not just a recreational setting, is going to go up. But the interesting thing, I was just reading a study about this last week, is that the benefits of psychedelics are directly tied to their visionary nature, and spiritual experiences during recreational use is also very common. What this means is that the efficacy of some of these drugs for treating PTSD or anxiety or depression has a very strong correlation with the spiritual nature of the experience. So experiences of awe or transcendence, maybe it might be a sense of time travel back to when you were a young child and remembering your earliest memories. These sorts of experiences are what make psychedelic drugs so powerful for treatment. There we go. So just talking about therapeutic value a little more, there have been multiple studies in the past 10 years especially, that have shown that these substances, especially psilocybin, it's been the easiest to get approved for studies, but especially psilocybin is good for treating treatment-resistant depression, treatment-resistant anxiety, treatment-resistant PTSD, treatment-resistant addiction, whether that's smoking, alcohol, or narcotics. This aligns with data that we found in the 60s and 70s that these substances were helpful as well. So the power of these drugs is that they're very wide-ranging. You don't even necessarily have to be, quote, mentally ill to find benefit from these substances in a therapeutic setting. One study that Johns Hopkins did was about patients with cancer, and it was terminal. And all of us eventually have to accept that we're going to die. But these were many people in their 40s or 50s who simply shouldn't have to accept that they're going to die yet. And when looking at this, there was, when you gave these people psilocybin, their anxiety about death dropped dramatically for the long term. They came to terms with their mortality. They came to terms with how they're going to leave their family behind and how they can make life better for their family after they're gone. So instead of running from one's anxiety about death, running from mortality, these substances and the experiences they had on it forced them to face some of these. Now, some of these experiences, this is from William Richard's book, who's at Johns Hopkins, Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics and Religious Experiences. He has two particular experiences for narcotics addicts that I thought was very interesting. But one in particular I thought this congregation would appreciate. He says, the memory of one session with a young narcotic addict from an impoverished neighborhood within the inner city of Baltimore comes to mind. Lying on his back on our white couch, securely nestled between blue flannel sheets, wearing an eye-shaded headphones as the substance was taking effect, he sensed he was rising into heaven to meet God. He rose higher and higher, and as the clouds parted, suddenly he uttered a loud curse, tore off his eye-shaded headphones, threw off the sheet, sat up, looked me straight in the eye, and explained in alarm and dismay, God is a woman. It was clear that his Southern Baptist Sunday school had not prepared him to cope with the divine in its feminine manifestation. Yet the creative forces that were in his own mind appeared to introduce him to God in this manner. Just thought that was an interesting version of one of these visions for someone who is being treated with these substances for addiction. Here's a few more from the Marsh Chapel experiment. The Marsh Chapel experiment took place on Boston University's campus in 1962. Are many of you familiar with Howard Thurman, the civil rights leader? Howard Thurman was aware of this experiment and was preaching at the time of it and was quite excited to see how his sermon might affect people who were under the influence of these substances. So this was during the Good Friday service that Thurman was preaching at. And one subject, FK, said, I attempted to play the organ, wanting to play Christ the Lord is risen today, being motivated by a strange sense of joy. FK was a seminarian, and he was very disappointed, he goes on to say, that he was bad at playing the organ during this experience. He was really excited to try it. Subject BL said, I immediately began to meditate and pray and read my New Testament, 1 Corinthians 13. I began to pray for forgiveness and praise God for the blessings of life. And a final one, I couldn't find which subject this was from my notes, but this is someone I know went into ministry after. This seminarian said, before, I just felt as if I should enter the ministry, but now I know that I must. This participant reported experiencing a sense of call insofar as this means the word must be proclaimed to the world. The Marsh Chapel experiment's conclusion found that when looking at 10 seminarians and 10 other adult volunteers, including Huston Smith, when given these substances and asked to describe them, perfectly described what a mystical experience was like. And this could be induced by using psilocybin in the setting. Now, abstract issues are great. We can talk about theology. Is there really something out there that we experience during mystical visions or even during meditation or prayer? Or asking, if it's even important or necessary to have a personal pietist experience with religion, or if community is more important. These are worthwhile abstract theological questions. But I think the most important part of this study is particularly how this will affect people and pastoral care for people of the church. So I'm going to give 3 examples, some based on personal experience, of how this might arrive to our churches within the next 3 years, or has already arrived in our churches and they're just not telling us yet. So first, I introduce you to Franklin. Franklin is 78 and a Vietnam War veteran with PTSD. He's been in and out of the VA for years as new treatments come up. And for years, these treatments have failed. He's drank on and off through the years because he was just 18 years old. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know where he was being sent. His friends died right in front of his eyes, and he followed orders that he now recognizes were not orders he should have followed. He's been haunted by this for 60 years. And he comes into the pastor's office and says, "Pastor, you know, I've been in your church for years, and you've seen me as my family is broken down, and as I get better, and then I get worse again. And I've tried every treatment there is, therapy, medications. I just don't know what to do anymore. But the doctor suggested something new to me today. It's called psilocybin therapy. It's just been approved by the FDA, specifically for treating veterans with PTSD, like me. But I just don't know. Back when I was a kid, this stuff was thought to be pretty dangerous. And it's not something that good Christians did. Is this okay? Can a Christian take part in these therapies? How would we respond to them beforehand with this advice? And more than that, if they have this experience of maybe going up to heaven and realizing God is a woman, how are we going to accept them into our daily practice as a church? When we are just chatting among ourselves in a Bible study or having theological discussion, are we willing to listen to the experiences they have? There we go. Now we have Alan and Candace, who are 35. You see them at Thanksgiving dinner. And they're your nieces, they're your niece and her husband. And, you know, they were engaged for a rather short period of time and dating for an even shorter period of time before they got married. And there was some questions about the relationship before the marriage, but family supports family. But you notice they have been arguing a lot. Is who made the turkey too dry? Who was supposed to remind who about taking what out of the oven? About old problems that were coming and going that seemed to have built up into spite or anger in the marriage. And as dinner winds down and the dishes are being washed, they come talk to you and they say, you know, our marriage counselor suggested MDMA therapy. Again, this was a party drug back when we were kids. This isn't something that good people took. But they said there's several studies that show it can be really helpful for couples who are having problems. And we love each other. We want to stay together for the rest of our lives. There's no abuse or toxicity that's harmful between us, but we just can't seem to open up and communicate. So we trust you. You know, you're a mentor in our lives. What do you think? Should we do it? How do you think you'd be able to respond to that? Or how would a pastor respond to that? Especially if they were being asked to take part in some marriage counseling for the couple too. And then outside of therapeutic setting, this is one final example. Emma, 24, a psych student. She's come to the church a few times, and we've been excited to have her here. She's been more and more involved with the choir, has been even involved in meditation and leading Bible study. She's a really sharp woman who is bringing her skills and education as she works on her master's for use in the church. But it's interesting, you get bits and pieces of her background that she came out when she was about 16 and her parents kicked her out. Her family disowned her. Her church called her an abomination. And she decided that she was never stepping foot in a church ever again. There must simply not be a God, for who would have allowed this to happen to me? But during a concert about a year ago, a friend was chatting with Emma and said, you know, what's a fun thing to do at this party? I have some LSD, some acid. Do you want to try it? And what was supposed to be merely a fun party drug changed her perspective. When she felt awe and transcendence and joy and remembered the trauma of her childhood, even there in the club, had a moment when she realized, I'm not what my parents said I was. So maybe God isn't what they said he was either. And she shares the story with you and says, you know, I've been afraid to tell my testimony about coming to faith here at the church because I don't know how people will think of me. How am I supposed to explain that I have come to faith in Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior, through acid in the back of a nightclub? That's a little bit difficult to explain to people. Now, the thing is, this third story in particular, though a very different person than I've described, is something I have run into time and time again with college and young adult ministry. I have certainly run into many students who should not be playing around with drugs, don't get me wrong. In fact, I would say almost all of them. But that doesn't mean that I haven't run into a lot of students, including one 19-year-old, who had been terribly abused as a child, terribly abused. And after taking DMT one night, said that he encountered a being of pure life and pure love and pure comfort, who took him into his arms and said, you are not what your parents did to you, and you are not what your parents said you are. And the very next Sunday, he came back to church because he asked himself, who else could be pure light, love, and comfort than Jesus? Who else could it be? Now, whether you agree with that theology or not, that doesn't change the fact that these sorts of people will be coming into our church, or have come into our church. And they have stories to tell, and they have ideas and experiences to share with us. Are we ready to accept them for how they've come here to be with us and help them understand how to integrate these experiences into their daily life? So that's all of the presentation that I have for y'all. I think you can do a few minutes of question and answer. So if anybody has any questions, we can take a few minutes of that. And then I'll be sticking around for a little bit until service time and we can chat. If anybody wants to see these, I can pass these around. There is no LSD in this, I promise. But this is the sort of blotter art that is frequently used for the production and cultivation of LSD. And then this is a signed book on psychedelics from Timothy Leary that I really enjoy. And you can see Timothy Leary didn't have a good reputation. He was a bit of a jerk. And you can tell because he signed to Catherine something profound. And you can just see that Catherine asked him to write something profound. And that's exactly what he did. And just one last thing, if you are more interested in learning about this, I cannot suggest William Richard's book, Sacred Knowledge, anymore. I have a lot of critiques about some of its theology, but as an introductory text that can show us the direction that psychedelic therapy is taking and religious experience is taking, this is a great resource to be able to learn more.
Is that in a library? Do you know?
I don't know if it's in a local library.
Ours.
Oh, in this library? I don't think it is now. Yes.
I think quoting that book, you said, creation of his own mind was one of the phrases you used there.
Yeah.
You seem to describe them mostly as positive.
Mm-hmm.
And you've given us a lot of good examples, anecdotal examples of, what if somebody comes in, it's been a positive effect of their life.
Yes.
Why do you think it's positive? Or maybe you seem like it's positive in general. Why do you think it's positive in general if they're creation of their own mind? Why can't they also be negative? And I think then the question goes, okay, now somebody shows up and they had, something that we don't agree with come out of their trip.
Yeah,
How do we
absolutely.
deal with that?
Absolutely.
How do you embrace one, not embrace the other, perhaps?
Sure. There's a great article I was just reading called Lucy in the Sky with Nazis. And it was a depiction of how after the Charlottesville riots, and after January 6th too, a lot of these militias in different groups involved in right-wing violence, a lot of them had psychedelic drugs in their inside of their compounds or in their homes. When we're looking at these sorts of experiences, I think the important thing to realize is these drugs open people up. That's the best way to describe it. The neuroplasticity that occurs allows a lot of information to come into the mind that may be true or may be false. There's no evidence that psychedelic drugs can change your political or religious beliefs per se or affiliation per se. But especially if you are taking these things to reinforce what you already believe, it can be very, very dangerous. So I think in a clinical setting, which is a lot of what this was about, almost all experiences are positive. It is hard to have negative experiences in a clinical setting where the mindset of the patient has been evaluated by a professional and the setting of the experience has been dictated by a professional. Now, I definitely think there are people who have had negative experiences recreationally, and they are also people that need pastoral care. These are also people who I've come across who, experienced hell, quote unquote, and saw terrible things and want to know, is God going to judge me for this? So the fact that there are negative experiences, which are much more rare, that they have lasting negative effects, significantly rare. Nonetheless, these are people that I think we need to care for. I agree.
Has there been a lot of medical research on all these drugs? Medical research?
Not on all these drugs. Psilocybin has a lot of medical research. The FDA has been much happier with allowing for certain trials with it. But at this point, Johns Hopkins alone has over 100 studies that they've done on these substances in various situations. So much so that they've been able to redo studies accounting for variables that different people have brought up could be affecting the results. So psilocybin in particular, a lot of experiments. I'd say right below that is LSD, and then below that would be DMT. Mescaline.
Some of them are legal for physicians to prescribe.
Not for physicians to prescribe, but you can ask the FDA to allow for the substance to be used for a specific study. Now, the problem that was being had was that you need evidence it might be medically helpful to do the experiment, but you can't get the data until you do the experiment, so you can't ask the FDA for permission. A few experiments out of Switzerland, which was a little more open-minded to these sorts of things, allowed the US to have the data they needed to get this process started earlier in the 2010s.
Are these drugs legal anywhere in the world?
Yes. The naturally occurring psychedelics, so DMT, magic mushrooms, mescaline, these are legal in several places around the world, particularly in Latin America, where these are used all the time. Other drugs are so rarely known about that governments don't even bother, particularly in Africa, as I said previously. And then in the United States, Spain, Portugal, decriminalization in certain areas has reached the point that it's essentially legality. They are not going to prosecute you for these things. And at the same time, these things are sold openly with governments providing the tools necessary to test to make sure these drugs are safe, that they're not, infected with anything. So there's a massive gray area, but also some legality as well. All right, I think, what's up? We have a
There's
comment
one,
question?
yeah. So from Stephen Cotton, if a hallucinogenic experience can be equated to a religious experience, How should the church respond if those experiences are commodified by pharmaceutical companies?
Oh, a great question.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, if a hallucinogenic experience can be equated to a religious experience, how should the church respond if those experiences are commodified by pharmaceutical companies?
So as these drugs become legal to use therapeutically, what do we do if they're being commodified by corporations to make a profit? A lot of these treatments right now that are coming out in Oregon and Colorado especially, they cost the same amount as a small car to purchase, a used car, thousands of dollars. Meanwhile, indigenous and people of color activists who have been doing this for decades have unfortunately been placed in prison. So I think the question when you were asking about legality, the problem with legality instead of decriminalization is that people still go to prison for practices that they might have had for generations, while a group of pharmaceutical entrepreneurs get to make millions of dollars instead. So the reason legality hasn't become as common as decriminalization is specifically to prevent that, so that you don't have people making profit off these substances. That's gonna be the last one, unfortunately, because y'all gotta get to church and I do too. All right, sure. That sounds good. All right, thank you all so much for this. I'm happy to have brought this to you.